Hi, welcome to this RT2 session on responsible transparency, where we will be talking about balancing data sharing with disclosure limitation for human subjects. A little bit about me. My name is Jennifer Sturdy. I work with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a US government agency. The research background that I bring to this presentation is about 15 years experience working in program evaluation in international development, working with agencies like the World Bank and MCC. I've also spent about 10 years working in open data, working with various platforms and serving on the Data Disclosure Review Board at MCC. And when it comes to transparency and reproducibility, huge fan of BITSS. I worked with BITSS as a program director from 2015 to 2016, and happy to be back here at RT2. So where are we with the RT2 roadmap? We're here on day 4 in the bottom right-hand corner, covering topics around ethical research and data management. So who is this session for? I presented about 2 years ago at RT2, and I would say that at least with that group of students, the session was relevant for about half of them. So I like to kind of put out there, upfront, kind of who I think this is relevant for. If you're like me and you're working in the research ecosystem and produce or use data that relies on confidential, potentially sensitive data collected from human subjects, hopefully this is like right up your alley. If you only work on lab experiments or only use aggregate administrative data with no PII, a lot of this presentation may not feel super relevant. So up to you if you would choose to continue with us for this session. So up front, what are the top takeaways that I hope students take from this presentation? First, protection of confidentiality creates trust in research, and it certainly contributes to the quality and credibility of research. Laws and ethics govern why and how we protect confidentiality as researchers. Third, disclosure limitation, so whether for both data and documentation disclosure, is necessary to protect privacy. And that is easy for direct identifiers, but it's a lot tougher with and not so obvious sometimes with indirect identifiers, and we'll talk through that. Last, if our aim is reproducible analysis, then we need to consider early and often how to build disclosure limitation into our reproducible workflows. So hopefully this session helps complement other RT2 sessions on kind of how to ensure your analysis and publication workflow is reproducible. This session hopefully complements that if you work in the area of research that relies on collecting PII and sensitive data from human subjects, that you kind of build in the sort of thinking around statistical disclosure limitation early into your reproducible workflow. So in this presentation, I'm going to walk through 10 points that I hope you consider as you work toward kind of responsible transparency. The first point is define your North Stars, both legal North Stars and ethical North Stars. So what do I mean by that? So first, know your legal context. I am not a lawyer, but I have had to work with a lot of lawyers over the last few years to understand kind of the evolving landscape around data privacy laws internationally and how those laws may or may not affect research that is collecting, storing, managing, and potentially sharing data that has personally identifiable and potentially confidential information from human subjects. So thinking through the legal context for where you sit, what governs your work, but that also takes thinking through the legal context potentially for your funders and what governs their funds, and your research participants, your data providers. Where do they sit? Are they citizens of the US? Are they citizens of Benin? Both countries have very strict data privacy laws, and so carefully considering your legal context and how any data privacy laws may sort of govern what you need to think about in terms of the protocols you put in place for protecting the collection, storage, and hopefully, if we're working towards transparency and it's feasible, the sharing of this data. Last point on this, I am not a lawyer, but I do point you to the resource from HHS. They started building this in 2018, I think, and I have the link here in the slides, but there is a resource there that tracks by country IRBs and data privacy laws to keep in mind as researchers collecting this sort of information. Second point here is know your ethical code. So even if you work in a country without any data privacy law and you don't think you're bound by any legal requirements, I would still say we need our own ethical code that helps guide responsible transparency and responsible data sharing. Of course, as researchers, I hope we're all kind of familiar with the key ethical principles in research involving human subjects: respect for persons, beneficence, justice. Protection of confidentiality really does kind of weave throughout all three of these. And institutional review boards, which are our ethic boards that review research protocols, design, implementation protocols we put in place for protecting human subjects. They sometimes also will weigh in on sort of the ethical requirements or protocols that need to be established for data sharing. In my experience at MCC, I've seen IRBs be willing and excited to step into those conversations as we work with researchers on, what statistical disclosure limitation actions need to be put onto the data in order to share it. I've seen IRBs say that is completely outside of their scope. So, there is still some gray area in terms of kind of who occupies this space and provides kind of the ethical guidance around our requirements as researchers to kind of limit disclosure in the context of working toward transparency. But I'd say, even if your IRB is not engaging in this space, ask yourself, what's your own ethical code? Would you participate in your survey given what you're collecting and what your kind of protocols are in place for protecting confidentiality during data collection, storage, and as you work toward data sharing? Point number 2 is understand what data and documentation the study will produce and the risks associated, potential risks associated with that data, particularly if there was a unwanted disclosure. So first, does your study require the collection of personally identifiable information, so PII? I think this is pretty straightforward, but there are 2 categories here. Direct PII is really just information directly about the person or the firm, whatever your unit of observation is. So things like names, addresses, GPS coordinates of households or firm location, social security numbers, driver's license, other forms of identification that directly identify someone. The other category is the slightly more difficult one, and this is the area of quasi-identifiers or indirect identifiers. And I'll talk through a little later in the disclosure limitation toolkit section about how important it is to understand your study sample and how representative it is of the potential universe for that population that you're studying. But just to define indirect identifiers can be used to identify a person through association with another variable. An example of this, at least in my context, is something observable about an individual that's in the data. So something like land size. Land size is something that can be very visible and observable about a person, even if you remove their name from the data set. If they're the only person with that size property of land in that region, you don't need their name to know that that's the person that is that observation within the data set. So just to kind of wrap it up on what examples of indirect identifiers. It's a pretty classic example. I'm sure most of you already are aware of this. In 1997, LaTanya Sweeney actually was able to kind of using 2 de-identified data sets. One was voter registration, and one was a recently published de-identified medical records database. Using these two, she was able to re-identify the Massachusetts governor in the de-identified public medical records database. So really highlighting the re-identification risk involved with certain indirect identifiers, and how they can potentially link across other data sets that are available with not exactly the same information, but being able to link across those data sets actually ever increases the re-identification risk. She followed up this kind of experience with, in 2000, kind of writing about what percentage of the US population was likely to be uniquely identified by certain characteristics, and presented that at that time in 2000, 87% of the US population was likely unique based on 5-digit zip code, gender, and exact date of birth. And of course, how much more information is out there in the world about each of us now. So really highlighting that there's an ever increasing probability of re-identification within these data files, even when our direct identifiers are removed. So going kind of further along, so do you need to collect personally identifiable information in your study? Thinking about direct identifiers, thinking about indirect identifiers, and then do you need to collect sensitive data? And if something is sensitive, determining whether it's sensitive is really context specific. What is sensitive in rural Ghana may not be sensitive in San Francisco, and vice versa. Examples of sensitive data can include race, ethnicity, gender, health status, income, savings, assets, really any information about an individual or firm, whatever your unit of observation is that you have promised to protect confidentiality for, that if it's disclosed, it can also pose risk of harm potentially to that data provider. So that's why we carefully think through the sort of sensitive data that we're collecting alongside PII. So in addition to PII and sensitive data, really kind of flagging that we need to understand what sort of linkage documentation exists already about our study sample, or that even we as researchers are producing. So for example, in the world of project evaluation, we certainly deal with this challenge because for our treatment groups, the treatment groups in the program evaluation sample, there's a whole mirror to our study sample in terms of documentation about that group on the project side. So beneficiary lists, potentially like case studies and blogs about beneficiaries and their participation in the project that we're evaluating. And then there's the study materials we produce, a PAP, a pre-analysis plan, or another design document that actually presents, the sampling strategy that provides potentially a lot of granular detail on how a study sample is constructed. That sort of linkage documentation can potentially be used to increase the re-identification risk of our data providers, even if we're removing, again, direct identifiers. And so really thinking through how does the linkage data and documentation affect our future ability to kind of implement statistical disclosure limitation strategies, and how does it affect our ability to share data in the future potentially. So one last point on this is using kind of a continuation of the example of the 1997 case of Sweeney re-identifying the Massachusetts governor. I kind of was looking for the citation for it, and then also found in 2015, Barth Jones kind of reflects on this case and also flags that, while the re-identification of the governor was certainly through kind of these matching of indirect identifiers across data files, the fact that it became a certainty that his record had been found was because of a very public hospitalization that he had had when he was governor. And seeing that hospitalization in the record allowed for kind of confirmation and certainty that it was in fact the Massachusetts governor's medical record, as opposed to just a high probability that it might be. So again, thinking about these two kind of points together, what is disclosed in the data, so that's collected as a part of the study and survey, and what is disclosed outside but is still linkable to the data that can actually serve a potential re-identification risk. So in addition to thinking through what data is required for the study, PII, sensitive data, what data is being produced in terms of linkage data and documentation, just flagging to carefully consider data providers' risks. So what would a loss of confidentiality mean to a data provider, given the sort of information that you're collecting in your survey and in your data file that you may eventually want to also share with others? If there is a loss of confidentiality and an unwanted disclosure, could the data provider become a target for financial extortion, discrimination, gender-based violence? Do you understand these potential risks, and do your data providers? Do you have a shared understanding of these sort of risks? And are they clearly communicated at the time of informed consent? And I'll talk through informed consent a little later in the session. So all this, I do want to flag though, mitigating risk and thinking through kind of what data you have to collect for your survey and only collecting what you need for your survey. All of this is not an argument for exclusion of data or exclusion of certain populations from research just because there is risk. This is about talking about safeguards and careful considerations of data needs, and not just collecting everything in the kitchen sink just because you're there, and the marginal cost of adding another module to your survey on risky sexual behavior or something like that is low. The marginal cost is low, but actually the marginal risk may be very high, where everything we're adding that isn't directly linked to the needs of the survey that potentially increase disclosure risk and potential for risk of harm to the individuals, they really need to be carefully considered. So think through what the study needs to be credible, high quality, and then start working on establishing the necessary safeguards for protecting confidentiality all the way through to open data and data sharing it if it's feasible. Okay, point number 3, understand data flow across data handlers. So before I kind of walk through a standard kind of data flow across multiple data handlers, I just want to flag that part of that first section is thinking through very carefully what PII, what sensitive data we have to collect for the survey, and really finding a way to kind of flag that data in the questionnaire, in the data entry program, so that as you think through kind of your data flow and data handlers, who needs access to what data when, maybe it's a little easier for data management to kind of already have direct identifiers flagged, sensitive data flagged, so that as the data kind of makes its way through to data handlers that don't need access to the direct identifiers, they're easily removable, right? And so thinking through and identifying where the direct identifiers, sensitive data are in your data files, and possible indirect identifiers, although these are a lot harder to predict until you actually see the data. And using those flags to think through who can and should have access to what data and when. So I just want to walk through kind of, at least in my experience, kind of a basic general kind of sense of data flow across multiple data handlers. So a lot of my experience, again, is kind of in this field-based survey work where we're collecting primary data in the field. We have data collection staff, data entry staff, survey firm managers who are responsible for data collection. And that data then moves to the research team, principal investigators, research assistants, other analysts, and sometimes those teams can be quite large. And of course, that's kind of the main data handlers within a primary study. But of course, in the spirit of transparency and working toward data sharing, data handlers, kind of move beyond that. So there are other research teams where we may want the data to be accessible to them for reproducibility, for extending the analysis of the study. There are funders who may want access to the data. Journals, of course, ever increasing number of journals requiring code and data that underlies the journal article to be published alongside the journal. And other actors, familiar with the data who may want access to it. So thinking through this, list of data handlers, and early in kind of your kind of data collection design and study design, thinking through, well, who should have access to what when? In my experience, on the far left, these data collection staff, data entry staff, survey firm managers, they'll always be the ones that have access to the raw data, direct identifiers, probably the data that has the highest risk associated with it for improper disclosure, right, and disclosure risk. Moving to the research, the primary research team, oftentimes that team still has access to and wants to hold the raw data. But ultimately, this is about kind of poking at that and asking, well, but do they need to have the direct identifiers in the data file? Or can those already be dropped? Are they really necessary for analysis? In a panel survey, yes, maybe. In other surveys, not necessarily. And so thinking through, okay, well, what can be removed so that you're only kind of managing data along this data flow that is needed at that time by that data handler. Moving along to other research teams, oftentimes this is where statistical disclosure limitation is going to be required. Certainly removing direct identifiers and potentially starting to kind of work on reducing re-identification risk through indirect identifiers. And as we move to funders, journals, other kind of actors who may be interested in obtaining the data, this is where certainly we want to have kind of the maximum appropriate disclosure limitation kind of strategy implemented on the data to limit any improper disclosure risk. Now, all of this is complicated by the fact that we're not just aiming for data sharing as like a deliverable or to just be posted with the paper. We're aiming for data sharing for reproducibility purposes. And so part of this is really thinking through, okay, well, how do we keep the data that underlies the analysis as close as possible to the data that can be shared or shareable? Maybe that's still, only with a smaller group of data handlers for purely reproducibility purposes, or maybe it's, feasible to kind of implement statistical disclosure limitation strategies on data before analysis takes place. So thinking through, hopefully in your path, when along your data flow, along your reproducible data flow process, when can you and should you be implementing some or staged disclosure limitation strategies? So some of this, I think, can be kind of codified and documented early and often in a data management plan, at the very least kind of defining who should have access to what data when. I have links to a lot of these great resources where, places better than I can explain kind of what belongs in a data management plan. But I think this is all along the same lines as what we argue for with pre-analysis plans, right? Think through kind of what you want the future to look like. If you want the future to look like data sharing, but you still have to think through kind of protection of confidentiality and statistical disclosure limitation work and strategy, think through it early and start documenting it in your data management plan. Okay, point number 4, consider the data sharing spectrum. For a long time, when I was kind of working in this space, open data was public data. That was what we were aiming for. That was what we were talking about. I do feel like in even the early days of BITSS, there was just such an emphasis on make it public, make it public, make it public. And I wanted to kind of flag that, data accessibility, can be on a spectrum. And it's not, a super big spectrum, but, just aiming for public data sharing isn't the only goal that we have at our disposal, especially if what we care about is kind of balancing shareability with kind of still responsible management of who has access to what data when. So, typically we kind of have this very basic spectrum of data that is just never shared. We don't think it can be prepared, or we certainly haven't worked on preparing it for sharing. We have data that could be shared if we implement the right sort of protocols in place to limit disclosure risk. And then we have data that's just always shared and already public information. And so thinking through, in this never share category, is it really that it can never be shared? Or if we think early about things like a virtual data enclave or some other restricted access mechanism where the data is stored securely and certain researchers can access it for very specific purposes, does that help facilitate at least efforts around reproducibility of it? Going into the conditional share, again, considering what use should we make of restricted access mechanisms versus public use mechanisms, and making the data kind of public use and or restricted access use. And of course, in the always share is the public access data sharing mechanisms. So I flagged for the group, sometimes you don't have an option in terms of the data repository that you can use, but sometimes you do. And carefully kind of observing and understanding kind of what's out there and the fact that some data repositories actually can offer it all. They can, ICPSR certainly has kind of the three options of public use, public access data, direct download data, restricted access data where, certain researchers can apply for it and then, download it and take it with them, versus restricted access virtual data enclaves where, certain researchers are able to obtain permission to access the data in a virtual data enclave, run their analysis and take their outputs with them, but never actually touch the data. So just thinking through kind of what repository options exist for you and which ones you'd like to take advantage of, for kind of adhering to promises of confidentiality, but also potentially maximizing transparency. Okay, we're back. Sorry, I had a little tickle. So point number 5, understand our disclosure limitation toolkit. So I know I've been talking about this throughout the session, but now this is where I kind of go into a little more detail about what some of these methods are. So in my experience, disclosure limitation kind of has 2 categories that we need to consider, and I've talked about this already. Documentation is one area where we need to think about disclosure limitation, and data, so statistical disclosure limitation. When it comes to documentation, I've already spoken about this, but just to kind of reiterate, we need to think through what information we disclose about the study that can contribute to the re-identification risk of our study population. In my experience, this is taken kind of revisiting evaluation design reports or other study materials where we publish annexes that can have very detailed information on the sampling frame for the study. That sort of information may significantly support re-identification of those granular geographic units. And so we need to redact them from public documentation about the study design in order to kind of mitigate that re-identification risk. Same thing goes for data. So thinking through kind of on the spectrum of the type of data that we're dealing with, what sort of statistical disclosure limitation methods we need to implement. Certainly on the super sensitive, almost never share kind of side of the spectrum, the statistical disclosure limitation methods need to be very strong and rigorous. This is where we kind of have differential privacy, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But then in the categories of data and samples where we do believe it's possible to kind of mitigate re-identification risk using indirect identifiers, there's other kind of methods we can employ, and I want to walk through each of those. So the first step with statistical disclosure limitation is first de-identify the data, remove identifiers that we know to be identifiers. And if you're not sure where to start, HIPAA privacy rule protects individually identifiable health information, and it specifically lists out 18 identifiers that if you collect this data in a survey, you must remove from any sort of like public or accessible or shared version of the survey. But hopefully, if you've kind of followed my advice from earlier, in your questionnaire, in your data entry program, maybe you've already flagged within your data all of the direct identifiers, and it's a pretty easy lift to immediately remove those when you're ready to start preparing the data for kind of moving it along down that data flow, data handler chain with who you want to share the data with. Now, before we get into talking about these other kind of statistical disclosure methods, I just want to flag that before you kind of go into that sort of detail and sort of data permutations where you actually are changing the data, we, at least in MCC, have always taken a step back and worked with the research teams to assess the probability of risk for re-identification. This is usually just a context specific kind of exercise, and every study, at least in my experience, especially working internationally with very kind of rural populations a lot of times, this risk of re-identification really varies by study. So the main risk factors that we kind of look at are sample. So number one, asking ourselves and the research teams, are outliers in the data a re-identification risk? This answer can be obviously yes, or oh, we're not sure. If your study sample has only sampled a very small percentage of the overall universe of eligible, individuals or firms, the universe, for your population, then it's a lower probability that an outlier in the data is necessarily an outlier in that very, very large, population that you've just sampled a tiny fraction from. If you have, a sample where you've sampled, a large percentage of your target population, let's say within a village or within, a district, you've sampled, over 50% of the households, well, then, an outlier in your data, there's a higher risk that an outlier in your data is an outlier in the actual population. And so you have a higher probability of re-identification risk. Second risk factor that we think through is linkage documentation. I'm not going to spend much more time kind of hammering that point home, but again, what documentation about this sample exists? So if there's limited to no linkage documentation, you have a lower probability of re-identification risk. And I certainly, given the sort of settings that we're working in some of our program evaluations internationally, these are populations where there just isn't a lot of linkage documentation out there. Now, if you're working in the U.S. and you're sampling population in the U.S., you're working in a population where there is a significant amount of linkage documentation about the population. And as Sweeney kind of proposed in 2000, 87% of the population could be re-identified by just those three characteristics. So again, context specific, but really understanding what linkage documentation exists for your sample. Third risk factor that we think through is timing. So how closely does the data today that you're looking to share and publish, how closely does it reflect the current reality? So if you've collected data on a very transient population, or many, many years have passed since you collected the data, there starts to be, a much lower risk of re-identification, right, for those individuals or for those firms, because the situation now is very, very different. And so others who may want to, re-identify, individuals or firms within the data would have to know what was happening in the context 5 years ago or whenever you collected the data. If the data was recently collected and it's for a population that doesn't move around a lot, then you have a higher probability of re-identification. So thinking through kind of these or other relevant risk factors for your study before you go into kind of the variable by variable data permutation is really helpful to think through what's necessary. So getting into perturbation, the first place we usually start with our research teams out at MCC is thinking about geographic units. So how are geographic units used in the analysis, and what is needed to be identified versus needed, just in a randomized numerical code for the analysis. So thinking through that carefully, because of course it's balancing kind of what you want to de-identify to make the data public or shareable versus what you need to remain identifiable for the analysis and reproducibility. So what is the highest geographic unit you can de-identify while maximizing the usability of the data? If you can de-identify up to higher geographic units, meaning the population sample is coming from a much larger and larger potential population size, you're lowering the risk of re-identification quickly. If you think you need to leave much lower units of geographic units identifiable, that means, of course, you're in a much narrower potentially population where re-identification risk is higher. So start with geographic units. If you can go up high, at least in our experience for the context we work in, that requires much less variable by variable data permutation because the de-identification is kind of happening through the geographic unit de-identification. Okay, moving to variable by variable kind of data coarsening. This is about, again, re-identification risk, and not all outliers pose a re-identification risk. Really, this takes carefully understanding your sample and the context, but certainly for variables and data that is observable or known about this population, considering when to treat outliers and coarsen their values so that outliers in your data don't then serve a re-identification risk. So thinking through, observable things like asset holdings, land size again was another one. Identify the cutoff based on what the data is telling you. There is no rule, at least in our experience, that like you want to cut off your outliers and send them to the median for the top 3% or the top 5% or the top 10%. Really, it depends on what your sample looks like and what you know about the study population and what it's drawn from and the population is drawn from, and the extent to which outliers in a certain area actually have a significant re-identification risk. So understand your sample and then kind of treat the top and bottom coding accordingly. And in addition to kind of treating the top and bottom coding, thinking through collapsing categories. So for a lot of survey work, looking at survey responses where there are pretty unique responses and very few observations of a particular response, collapsing those into bigger categories. Of course, if they get collapsed into bigger other categories, sometimes that really reduces the usability of the data. And so just again, kind of getting this balancing act right of collapsing data, whether it's in a survey when you're collecting information on, I know in some of our surveys, languages spoken in the house can even be like a significant re-identification risk, especially for very unique observations. And so collapsing them into a category where, it's called, the category is called, all 3 or 4 languages that are in that group, as opposed to just other. There's still some value in the way that data is being collapsed, but it's a means by which you're also reducing the re-identification risk. So one point I do like to flag, just because BITSS is with SIGA, and SIGA, of course, has a big community of program evaluation and impact evaluation work. So I do flag for anyone at RT2 who also works in program evaluation, there's a particular additional risk around kind of treatment status that can exist. depending on how treatment of the program was assigned and what is known about who participated in a program. So, because this is the area I work in, I've seen quite a few examples where, for example, we want to be really public and publicize the lottery by which we're selecting villages that will receive a particular intervention, and so that list is published in the newspaper. It's a very public event. But then in one example, years later, when we realized we wanted to de-identify the data, prepare it for public use, just the inclusion of that treatment variable meant that we couldn't de-identify the villages. And by having just the name of the village kind of easily re-identifiable, that significantly increased the risk of re-identification for the individuals that were surveyed in those villages. So thinking through carefully your treatment status variable, and is that in itself an actual indirect identifier based on how treatment status was assigned and what was known about individuals who participated in that program and where they live. So it's not an easy thing to get around. In the example I just cited, we ultimately landed with having a public use file that disseminated a de-identified version of this massive household survey over multiple rounds, but we didn't include the treatment status in the public use file. The treatment status is only included in a restricted access file for cleared researchers who would only be working on that analysis for specific purposes. So again, balancing act, but kind of recognizing when you're dealing with program evaluation that that again can actually be or serve as another indirect identification risk. So this last point, I kind of skipped over it in the beginning, talking about the spectrum of data disclosure limitation kind of methods that we have at our disposal, and that's mainly because I'm not the most technical person in the room. I've lived and breathed kind of a lot of these other statistical disclosure limitation strategies, but differential privacy is something I just haven't worked with. I'm not a computer scientist, but there are really, really smart people who are working on this. And if you work with the type of data that relies on data collected from human subjects, you have concerns about protecting privacy, and you work in contexts like the US where just applying some of these basic statistical disclosure limitation methods aren't going to be sufficient, you might want to kind of look into the privacy tools group at Harvard and kind of think through if differential privacy might be a tool that you could use for kind of mitigating disclosure risk while also potentially still being able to share your data. So sorry that I'm not an expert on it, but hey, there are lots of smart people working on this, and I'm sure if this is the area that you need for statistical disclosure limitation in your toolkit, there are resources out there for you. So qualitative data, I've been speaking mostly about quantitative data, household surveys, enterprise surveys, data where the direct identifiers and indirect identifiers are quantitative data collection, survey instruments, and measurement tools. When it comes to thinking about data sharing, when your research relies on qualitative data, I think we get into a little bit more of a thornier issue. Indirect identifiers are much easier to manage, or at least kind of wrap your head around in the quantitative data. And with statistical disclosure limitation methods like data coarsening, you can implement those and still really retain data usability. In qualitative data, focus group discussions, semi-structured interviews, this data really, the richness and usability of this data is inherently tied to the identifiability of the data. And at least in my experience at MCC, we've almost universally kind of made a call that we don't think that it's usually feasible to kind of try to limit disclosure risk within qualitative data and retain its usability. There's just not a lot of statistical disclosure limitation methods that we've seen that apply. And so almost universally, we just don't make the qualitative data that underlie our evaluations accessible, mainly to continue protecting the confidentiality of those who participated in the qualitative research work. I know a few years ago, this group started to kind of wrap their heads around and get really smart people working on this issue of how to kind of integrate qualitative data into the transparency kind of revolution in social science research. And I just haven't been able to keep up with it, but I do flag it for you if you are a qualitative data researcher and you're interested in thinking through kind of what could be done to the data to prepare it for sharing with others, for reproducibility for others purposes, then I encourage you to kind of look at this or seek others out. I just haven't found the right answer for it yet. So the last point I'll make kind of about thinking about your statistical disclosure limitation toolkit is one that I've already made and I keep making over and over again, mainly because this is kind of the heart of kind of aiming for data sharing for transparency and reproducibility. But if you need to kind of implement statistical disclosure limitation methods on the data that severely kind of alter it, you also alter your ability to share data that reproduces your results. And that sometimes is okay. And sometimes that's just because we didn't think early enough in the process to build the statistical disclosure limitation work into the reproducible workflow. So again, this is just another flag to think about your disclosure limitation toolkit and think about it early so that hopefully to the extent that it's feasible, you're building it into your reproducible workflow. All right, point number 6, develop an informed consent. This is, obviously critical for ensuring that you're communicating with your data providers what data you're going to collect and who you're going to share it with and what you need to do with the data in order to share it with those other data handlers. So I know I'm running a little light on time, so I just want to quickly go through this, but I've shared in the resources page the template that MCC has developed for this. And I just flag kind of 2 requirements under at least US, the common rule, the protection for federal policy for protection on human subjects, where in the informed consent statement, there do need to be 2 relevant statements to us and relevant for data sharing. A statement describing the extent to which confidentiality will be maintained and who will have access to the data. So in the template, that I've shared from MCC, we've kind of acknowledged that depending on if you're collecting PII, depending on if you're collecting sensitive data or not, your informed consent statement can kind of take different tracks if you're trying to work toward making the data accessible to just the primary research team versus other researchers for facilitating things like reproducibility. So thinking through again, especially early and often, but this is, as early as the informed consent stage, defining, what data will be shared and with who, and agreeing to that with the data provider. The second point, and this is new under the revised common rule, we need a statement that information collected for the research might be stripped of identifiers and used in other research in the future, or that this will not happen, that you will not be stripping identifiers and sharing the data. So this is new under the revised common rule, where you have to be explicit with how you are going to share de-identified data. And obviously this is important for us in our efforts towards transparency, and certainly new for at least US requirements in the informed consent process. Okay, point number 7, consider the evolving context that you're working in. I just flagged this because it's a quick reminder that you may have assessed your data provider's risks and the need of what you needed to state in the informed consent 3 years ago when you first collected baseline data, and maybe a year ago when you were collecting, the follow-up data. But risk changes, things change. And just because you obtained informed consent 3 years ago doesn't mean you don't ever have to think about your data provider's risk again. And I think, I pose the question to everyone here, how has your risk assessment of certain things changed in the last year? I don't know about you, but I didn't used to think going to the grocery store was risky. But now, I'm wearing my personally protective gear to go to the grocery store every time. So risk and vulnerabilities change, and understanding how they have evolved during the study timeframe can help with understanding what you can or need to do to the data in order to share it, or realize that actually because of evolving risk for this particular study sample, given this sort of data that you collected, maybe it's not feasible to share. And just being really careful about kind of considering risk as an evolving factor that can really change over time. Point number 8, so that all kind of ends with providing a clear transparency statement. So this is something that I certainly do promote at MCC. We've been requesting it for about 2 years now, where we just ask for researchers to be very clear at the end of the study what data they are able to prepare and share publicly and or restricted access data files, and the extent to which that data actually replicates the results that they are publishing in our evaluation reports or other journal publications that are affiliated with the evaluations. But this is just a kind of an extra layer of the transparency piece where, we accept, at least at MCC, and I think others, rational actors within the research ecosystem would accept, being very transparent about the fact that you can't share all of the data that underlie your analysis. It is something that is certainly feasible if it's not possible to protect confidentiality and share the data, even for reproducibility purposes. And so just being very clear about that in a transparency statement, and also being very clear the extent to which the statistical disclosure limitations that you have to put on a data set that you can publish may or may not replicate or have slight adjustments to the sort of analysis or results that you would see depending on the data file that you can run it on. So again, just communicating this to new users and even yourself in the future. And I give an example. There are a few up on the MCC catalog, but this is one example that I think would be useful to reference of what a transparency statement can look like. Point number 9, establish a system to manage adherence to kind of your ethical code, your legal requirements, whatever kind of guidance you as an agency or even just as an individual have put in place to ensure responsible transparency. So I kind of flag a couple of different protocols, areas where kind of statistical disclosure limitation, other disclosure limitation kind of strategies are defined. Depending on where you sit, you may already have protocols in place for, ensuring this kind of balancing act of working towards transparency, but while still protecting kind of confidentiality and protecting human subjects, or not. And it might be a space that you want to step into. I've certainly had to step into that space at MCC, working on the TREAD guidance that I flag here. And with BITSS, Fernando and I worked together with the IDB to produce their transparent, reproducible, and ethical research kind of best practices. But yeah, just think through kind of where is it written, the process you need to follow for your research to make sure you're working toward responsible transparency, and think through the checks and balances that are there. Is the IRB going to be participating in reviewing your disclosure limitation Actions. Do you have a disclosure review board like we've had to establish at MCC that's reviewing the statistical disclosure limitation proposals, your proposal, others' proposals, to make sure that that balancing act of working toward public use or restricted access use data, is kind of giving the right balance of sharing the data for reproducibility, for broader use of the data, while also balancing protection of human subjects. And the last point, hopefully I can leave 5 minutes for question and answers, is think early, think often about data sharing at every stage of research. So I think this is just something I try to hammer home every point. For many years at MCC and even when I was on research teams at the World Bank, we didn't think about data sharing and statistical disclosure limitation until well after the study had ended, even when we, in those days, after the publications were already out. And really, that limits a lot of what you potentially can do with the data, and certainly what you can do for reproducible workflow. And thinking through, integrating your statistical disclosure limitation work early into the process to try and keep what data you run your analysis on as close as possible, if feasible, to the data that can be shared. So think early, think often throughout kind of every stage of the research. Okay, so top 4 takeaways one more time. Promises to protect confidentiality create trust in research. They ensure quality of the data, and of course then quality and credibility of the research itself. We need to understand the laws and ethical codes that govern why and how we need to protect confidentiality, even as we kind of think and work toward sharing this data. Disclosure limitation is necessary to protect privacy. This is something that is easy to do for direct identifiers, but it is not so easy or obvious to do for indirect identifiers. That is very context specific, study specific. And if our aim is reproducible analysis, we need to consider early and often how to build disclosure limitation into our reproducible workflows. So I know this is a little longer than we wanted it to be, but hopefully we have enough time for some Q&A. Thank you.